China is the big exception to Donald Trump's climb down on tariffs. He's doubled down on Chinese goods, raising the rate on imports to the US to 125%. That's likely to cause a major slowdown in trade between the two countries, which in turn could mean Chinese goods being redirected to Europe. And many in the bloc say that would have disastrous consequences.
American beef and California wines are available at this supermarket in Beijing. But with China's reciprocal tariffs, they're about to get more expensive. So far, there's little sign of panic among residents after the latest escalation in the trade dispute.
I think for ordinary people, we might slowly see some changes. But I believe our country is quite self-sufficient now, so it might not have a major impact on our daily lives. But they could affect some businesses related to imports and exports.
I'm not really worried. Conflicts are inevitable. It just depends on how the country handles it. Even if it ends up in a local conflict or a hot war, our country is not afraid. Of course, I think the goal should be to minimize harm to ordinary people.
So far, neither side shows signs of backing down. The U.S. has placed 125% tariffs on Chinese goods entering the country. China is taxing U.S. imports at 84%. Last year, China exported $439 billion worth of goods to the United States. U.S. exports to China were worth a total of $144 billion. The higher tariffs are likely to reduce the total trade volume. Container ships from China may now prefer to dock in ports in Latin America and Europe.
I hope that the governments in Beijing and Brussels will find a way how to control a possible overcapacity tsunami coming into Europe, that it will not trigger trade barriers. We want Chinese investment in Europe, and we don't want these containers overloading our economy. So in a way, it's all about communication and trust between Brussels and Beijing.
And if the trade war isn't resolved swiftly, American wines could soon become a thing of the past on shelves in Beijing.
Let's explore some of these issues with Mark Hallerberg, who's Professor of Public Management and Political Economy at the Hertie School here in Berlin. Welcome to DW. Let's start with China's response to these US threats. What is it about China, or indeed its economy, that means that it is standing up to what it's called Donald Trump's bullying rather than waiting and seeing, as other countries have done?
Well, some of this is that China has had a plan in place for some time. I mean, they saw some tariffs when Trump was president in his first term. The second time around, they had a set of policies that they had laid out. This included counter tariffs against the U.S. This includes a so-called national team with domestic markets to bring together different sorts of firms to try to boost the domestic stock market. And I think we should also think about what the narrative is in China without the U.S. I mean, the economy has been weakening over time. And I should say, I mean, this fight with the United States provides a perfect narrative to say it's not a domestic problem, but it's really a problem with the U.S.
And in this era of intertwined cross-global supply and production change, doesn't the US come out of this worse if its iPhones and children's goods and plastic novelties all end up more expensive, given that China ships so much more stuff to the US?
Well, you said the U.S. I think it depends who we're talking about in the U.S. and what ultimately happens and where this ends. And what I mean by that is one thing that Trump did not suspend is a minimum of 10% tariffs on most of the world. And he needs this money for the tax cuts that he's planning. It won't cover those tax cuts. But at the same time, there is a certain revenue generator role that he has always talked about in terms of tariff policy. My expectation would be that there will be some sort of trade war. It benefits both sides to some extent, although I think China will be hurt more. I would also expect at some point some sort of reconciliation where rates will be higher than before, but not as high as they are now. So that means your iPhone, for now, by the way, there's also a question of where will it be produced. It may be produced in the future in India instead of in China. Other things have moved to Vietnam. And so there is a little bit of deflection, but I would still assume at some point that there'll be some sort of reconciliation.
So if Chinese goods do end up being tariffed out of UF markets, does that mean they end up flooding other markets like here in Europe and elsewhere?
I think that fear is rational. That is, of course, a concern. I know that Brussels is indeed talking to Beijing about exactly this. I think it really depends on which goods. There are already some tariffs, for example, on Chinese automobiles, in particular electric automobiles, which are frankly more produced at a cheaper price and arguably as good a quality, if not higher quality, than European automobiles. That's not something that's going to change. And indeed, those are goods that aren't imported into the US. And so I think it will depend on which market we're talking about. But yes, there will be some pressure on the European markets.
And does this mean then that we, non-US consumers, do we end up benefiting from this sudden flood of cheaper Chinese goods driving prices down?
That's a complex one simply because there are other effects on the economy as well. I mean, these tariffs, a 10% tariff and a 25% tariff on automobiles is going to hit the German economy. Yes, some things may then in the end be cheaper, but I think the overall effect on the economy is a negative. And indeed, the change in policy overall will not be good for Europe.
Okay. Is Donald Trump's decision to pull all his other so-called reciprocal tariffs on hold, to put them on hold, is that a sign of a rethink, a considered strategy, or is this chaos in the White House?
Well, I mean, I think for the first time in a long time, one can truly think about one individual being most important. I mean, we often talk about what does a president want, but there's always been a staff, even in Trump's first term, that had a lot of sway. In this specific case, it really does seem to come down to one individual. Having said that, if I were to look at this at the very beginning and say, well, he wants to raise some more revenues, and while he does this, he also wants to pry some concessions from other countries, the strategy is not a bad one. I mean, again, I think the floor will be 10% no matter what. That will bring in some money as well if he gets more natural gas purchased by the European Union from the United States and other sorts of concessions around the world. There will be some marginal benefit for the US.
Okay, thanks for talking us through that. Professor Mark Hallerberg from Berlin's Hertie School. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.